We welcome everybody to join us in the circle and move a little bit closer. We appreciate the support. So my name is Brenda Tafoya, and I'm the executive director of El Sereno Community Land Trust. I'm part of the LA Coalition, and I'm here with my colega, compañera, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, all. My name is Linda Quiquivix. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially after the Rooted in Black Resistance panel, I think that I think it's really important to be able to listen. Sometimes just listen, and I personally have lost some of my greatest fights to Black compas, and I've been better for it, and so. My name is, again, Linda Quiquivix. People call me Kiki. I am a Native American Maya mom, geographer, and also I am director of strategy and education. I do a lot of popular education with El Sereno CLT, but not just in CLTs, also in parks, living rooms, farms, gardens, bicycle shops, and I'm also an author of a book called Palestine 1492, which is about how land becomes property over the last 500 years and how that relates to us today in the work that we do with CLTs.
Thank you so much, Kiki. Yeah, a little background on myself. I actually worked with large affordable housing for a very, very long time, and particularly in housing. And I absolutely was about to give up, like throw in the towel. I particularly worked with like residents and the tenant engagement, and I just felt that there was a big like disconnect with the way that big affordable housing works. And I actually found that I had just been working in the wrong space and found the CLT work to be where I really felt that the voices that have not been heard in the struggle of battling homelessness in LA was really in the movement and in the CLT work. I think this presentation is regarding our experiences in the CLT work, and we felt like really a need to report back and how we've gone through a lot of things that we would love to share, and then how we found the, I guess what we would say, how we healed in a way through a lot of the struggles that we can experience in our work. But I think it's important for us to start off in 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 the same stage, in the same space. And I'm gonna pass it on to Kiki.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I always, whenever I talk about community land trust, and especially in the context of California, where I live, I like to talk about how it was that land even began to be speculated on in the first place. And that begins with settler colonialism. And so, where we work in Tovangar, Los Angeles, when we're talking about real estate lots and plots, the precursors to those are the ranchos, which are the subdivisions of land that the Spanish mercenary soldiers were granted so that they could settle the land. And so rather than just fighting the native people, they were given land, massive tracts called ranchos, where they could become cattle farmers. And so then the cattle would also be deputized to displace the native populations. And so from those ranchos, we get the Spanish Empire having those ranchos for the soldiers. And then when there's this Mexican independence, which was a bourgeois independence of the colonizers' descendants, then we get the Mexican Empire. So we move from the Spanish Empire to the Mexican Empire. and then we get the American Empire. And in all three empires, and today the fourth empire is arguably a global empire because Los Angeles is a global city. From those empires, what we have is the logic that land is an object, and that you could, as a human being, be separated from it and look above the earth as if you're the owner, as if you're God, and you can cut it up into objects to give away or to sell. That is not how indigenous peoples in this continent, indigenous peoples in Africa, indigenous peoples in Europe, even Asia, have understood land over hundreds of thousands of years. But that is where we're at today. This is the context. So this is a map of the old Spanish and Mexican ranchos. Uh, where we are in our CLT, El Sereno CLT, it was part of the San Gabriel Mission land, so the concentration camp that re-educated Native peoples, enslaved them in order to build those missions and to exterminate them as indigenous peoples. When we get the American Empire, you start seeing more and more subdivisions, like through inheritance. Someone dies, and so then they have to divide their land among their children, and then those become subdivided even more, subdivided even more. That's how we got to where we're at, through this logic that land is an object. And the speculation comes from speculating that there's not going to be any native people on this land. We're going to kick them out, per the Spanish, the Mexican, the American Empire perspective. And therefore, the land will be more valuable. That's the speculation. And that didn't happen just in California, that happened throughout all of these lands. And in fact, the founding fathers of the United States, many of them were land speculators. And the speculation was that they were betting that they could ethnically cleanse the land and increase the value. Notice also that Orange County used to be part of Los Angeles in this map. With us here on the left side on the green, that's the city of Los Angeles. That's the original pueblo uh, uh, that the settlers created in Tovangar. And to the east is Rancho Rosa de Castilla, which was annexed by the city of Los Angeles, and that's where El Sereno is. And so then once it's annexed, it starts being subdivided, and El Sereno specifically was called Bairdstown. So then you see here, I don't know where I'm pointing to. Yeah, there's a photograph from 1905 where they're selling these lots, right? This is not that far away in history. This is very recent, but we forget because we're not taught this in schools. We're taught that the world is just this way, and we just have to live with it, right? And so when we talk about also this phrase BIPOC, and it was so important in that last panel that we are more specific with what that means. I've witnessed how the discourse has changed from all of us being called people of color to Black people specifically demanding specificity. There's something specific to the Black experience in this country, not just in this country, but it's very global. Within a context of white supremacy, the opposite pole is anti-Blackness, right? And then people of color can have more tools. We have more tools to be not Black, right? And so, like, you get a lot of this, especially in brown communities, a lot of anti-Blackness, and it's structural. It's not something that we're born with. We're just taught that life is easier when you're not Black. So if you can't be white, at least don't be Black. So it is very important to not just say people of color without understanding that there are specificities to Blackness, and there's specificities also to indigeneity. And this is like the importance also of the I, right? If not forgetting the I also in BIPOC, because the term BIPOC, as I've traced it, it was a response of this critique that came particularly from Black people that said we can't just say all POC, we have to be specific. And now we have this term BIPOC, except we're just like using it like we were using all POC, you know? And so that's something really important for us to not forget, and to not forget that what the B is and what the I is, right? And there's still POC, of course, but let's not go back to what we were doing and just homogenizing the experience the same way for everybody. So I'm pointing at the wrong thing. So where we're at here, the California CLT network. I showed you maps of Tovangar, Los Angeles, but these ranchos were spread throughout California, especially in the coast, and you see a lot of the Bay and, of course, the Southern California area. And you see Mexican land grants. A lot of them are connected to rivers. Of course, like a lot of the settlers settled where there were already native people settled who already knew where the water sources were, where the food was, right? Like it wasn't like a genius out of them. Like they were copying what the native people were doing, how they had listened to the land for so many generations. And so you see a lot of these land grants alongside rivers, just like the Los Angeles River, right? That first pueblo is right next to the LA River, which sadly has now been turned into a storm drain and a wastewater refuge. It's not treated with the respect of the river. And where we're at, uh, this is the closest land grant that I found to where we're at right now, near Fresno. And so this is the Laguna de Tache Rancho. And what I want to bring out, and then I'll pass it on over to Brenda to give a little bit more specificity on how this looks in the housing space, because Brenda has a lot of experience working in the affordable housing space and also in the CLT space. And what we love about the CLT space, I think what all of us love about CLTs is the community control part, is that it's very rooted in the below, although there is a lot of fights over if that really is going to be community controlled or if it's just going to be permanent affordable housing without the community control part. And so I have this in Spanish, but what it means is arriba is above and abajo is below. And so when we're talking about the world that we're living in, the colonial world, that I was just showing how land is treated. And I talk a lot about 1492 forward because we're living in a global context where what the colonizers did in these lands has been globalized into a logic and a practice where there's a superiority and an inferiority. Like every difference is superior or it's inferior. So every time we come into contact with each other, we're taught to like size each other up, whether it's the way we look, what we drive, where we live, how much money we make, where we work, all of that. And so what we're told, and this is the importance of understanding the specificities of Blackness too, when we're talking about racialization and white supremacy and people of color, we do talk a lot about white supremacy. We need to also talk about anti-Blackness at the same time because those are two poles, right? If you can't be white, at least don't be Black, is what we're taught, right? When you're a person of color who's not Black. And so what we're taught is to assimilate up into becoming the above. And we have a lot of these metaphors of like moving up the ladder, right? One of these things, moving up the ladder. What's another one? Yeah, yeah, and yeah, we have this really terrible phrase. It's from the Spanish colonizers, like to improve the race, mejorar la raza, right? And so like marrying into a white family is what you're raised to do as like a your horizon. But the thing is that when we move up, just assimilating into being an American or being, white or close to white adjacent, there's still a below, and that's an unethical position, right? And so what we're going to talk about in this space, and we love to hear all of y'all's experiences as well, because what the theme is horizontality. How do we get away from this logic and this practice within CLTs that are really trying to, at their best, get the grassroots to control the CLT, to govern the CLT, but within we're really stuck in this whole system that favors the above, the technocrats, right? Like that's where the money goes, like the scale, the massive big developments, and that seems to be more important than community control. But what we're going to argue is that it doesn't have to be these two extremes. We can reconcile it, we believe, and we're sharing from the experiments that we've been on in these last couple of years working in CLTs, because what we've noticed with a lot of CLTs is that many CLTs desire a horizontal structure, and we don't, and we're fumbling trying to figure out how to get there. And so that's what we'd like to share with you all about our experiences and also hear yours as well. And I'll pass it over to Brenda, and then we'll come back to what we think could be a proposed solution.
Thank you, Kiki. I It's so important to get that background because the big picture is we can't talk about being horizontal if we don't acknowledge where our system came from. And big affordable housing is built on this system. And when I mentioned earlier, when I introduced myself, like where, that I was feeling disconnected in my work in housing, I didn't have the words and the understanding or the historical context of why I was feeling that way. Not, I just saw that I wasn't allowed in the board meetings. I couldn't contribute a lot of those hard skills. I had to like learn on my own. I had to power map on my own to figure out where the money's going, how it's being funneled, and how community becomes like an afterthought in these like big developments. And it was really because of everything that Kiki had mentioned. And then I found myself in the CLT world. And I was like, this is it. This is where I'm meant to be. And I'm going to mention something that we don't really talk about in this space, but I think it's so important because it's we need to talk about power. We acknowledge that there's the power from above, and we acknowledge that assimilation is something that we've been trained to desire, especially in this capitalist system. But what happens when you're now a community organizing space? You become a CLT, you officially become a 501c, and you get your first acquisition. All of a sudden, now you're taxed with the deliverables, with the same as in the nonprofit industrial complex. Now CLT is a multi-million dollar developer. Now you have deliverables reports. And then there's something that big developers know and have been trained and have access to. That's all those hard skills where community knows about soft skills. The facilitation, the conscious building, the conflict resolution, the relationship building, but maybe not necessarily like the property management or the legal compliance or the financing stuff. And then you find yourself that there's y- our communities are now stuck in this in between where do you scale? Do you mimic big affordable housing because they have a model already exemplified that shows like success? And I saw this at the Grounded Solutions conference. I don't know if you all went, but one of the things are like scale, scale, scale. And I was like, am I in a national CLT conference? What in the world is going on here? No offense to some of the workshops, but I did not see the representation that we've mentioned, and it wasn't grassroots led, and it just felt like another big affordable housing conference. And that's like the reality. And then working in the space, I realized sometimes there's something that a dirty secret that our communities don't want to talk about. And I'm gonna mention this, and maybe you can relate, maybe not, but it happens. What happens when you all of a sudden you have a community that has access to money and you don't have the skills to manage it? Well, there's two things that I realized that there's the administrative portion that never goes away on this work, and then there's the community work. And then sometimes you're stuck with now having to maneuver community to try to get them to work towards these like deliverables because the speculative market doesn't go away. And the reality is we are now tasked to work with community in bringing capacity and how they're going to maneuver in the space that they've seen and been fearful of and have to deal with because of displacement and all these housing authorities and all these issues, and now you have to somehow scale and work with municipalities. It's like how do you do that? And the truth is that we start doing something that we don't want to talk about, but you start pinning people against each other, our own peeps. Oh, you're being top down because you're asking for these reports and you have to do this to IRS. And then you have people who are like, we have to do this because let's not forget we are holding land in perpetuity. That means that our documentation has to be key. That means that we have to work extra hard in communicating these hard skills to our community. Not with that jargon word, or, all that like trainings. People don't have time to like learn that. We have to be able to work in the capacity of always reminding ourselves who work administratively in this work to bring down the knowledge to our communities. And we're really good at the soft skills, at the engagement and tenant engagement stuff, because that's like what it births. But let's be honest, it changes once you have an acquisition. It changes, and we have to prep our communities for that. And I just have to mention that one of the things that becomes really divisive is when you have people that think they're doing community work, but they're really in a very split position, and you develop a little bit of founder syndrome. You have founders who've been organizing for a very, very long time, and they're contributing, in getting people together. And then the acquisition happens and they don't want to let go. They still want to continue with that, having that control. And remember, this conversation is about power. We talk about and we can acknowledge the power from above. But what about those that try to mimic the above in the below? Sometimes you need to understand that asking for reports and having your ducks in a row, you're not trying to be top down, you're just trying to ensure that our communities keep the assets that we worked extremely hard to get. And the above is constantly looking of how we can somehow get them back and how counting on us to lose it. So we have to be extra organized and we have to learn those skills, but we have to teach our people those skills. And that way it's something that is building community. So I just want to acknowledge the conflict of this big divide between the top, the bottom, and how are we gonna find that solution? And sometimes it gets really uncomfortable because and it's in experiencing when you're transitioning community into their first acquisition into this realm of the speculative market that I mentioned that does not go away, still there. We have a long way to go to fix it. There's a strong need to for us to continue to divide. I mean to unite, but there is this division that is systemic. And if we don't learn to look out for it, even within ourselves, then that divide is going to continue. And so in working with my colleague, we worked in a co executive admin position. We've worked in a horizontal structure position, and we've worked in now where I'm an executive director. She's a director in our organization. Really, the true thing that we've noticed is let's talk about the flow of power. That is really where you're gonna get the conversation of horizontality. And and I think we've we think we might find something that we're like, let's go back to like what heals us. In our organization, we have an open space. And we always go back to our plantitas, to our plants, our native plants. And we're like, ah, the plantitas are gonna heal us. I'm gonna pass it back to Kiki.
Yeah, so so the title of this panel is Weaving the Milpa. And so we'll get to how the Milpa and what the Milpa is as a great teacher. So we have this problem where in a colonial world, a capitalist world, a patriarchal world, like everything that tries to dominate us is in this logic of there are some who are just superior and some who are inferior. And if you want to survive, because if you're below, you're being crushed. If you want to survive, then you need to figure out how to get above, right? Then you end up crushing others. And so then the cycle continues. So we're trying to break some cycles here. So rather than the below going above, what I've learned from native elders, and in particular the Zapatista movement in Chiapas, who are Maya resistors in struggle for 500 years, uh, they're great teachers of power. And so what they say is instead of above and below, and this is the women who say this in fighting patriarchy, because there is patriarchy in Zapatista communities, they don't want to cancel the men. They don't want to dominate the men, or they don't want to switch the positions of domination where women are above and men are below. And they don't want a world where it's just women and F the men. They say we want to be together and side by side, as the women that we are. So then this is what they say is that they go from below and to the left. And now this word left and this word right is really contentious. So I'm going to be very specific about how I'm using that word. The way I interpret that word and how the way they use that word is that the left is an ethical position against injustice. It doesn't mean Democrat, it doesn't mean liberal, it doesn't mean an identity. It's an ethical position against injustice. The way I use it is to point to a horizon that respects difference, whereas the right is a horizon that wants to dominate difference or annihilate difference or just impose one world, one world. What the Zapatistas say is a world where many worlds fit, in fact, where all worlds fit, rather than just the one world that we've been imposed since 1492 forward on the globe. Not to say that patriarchy started in 1492. Absolutely not. It's old. Domination is old, but the global nature of it is 1492 forward. So it's all of our problem now, everywhere that we are. And so then what the Zapatista women say is that we are equal because we are different, which is kind of like a kind of like a puzzle in your mind. Like, what does that mean? And I've sat with that, and what I get from that is that there's no standard for equality. And when I think about equality, I think about citizenship, right? Like in order to have rights to be equal, you need to check off some boxes. You either need to be born here or be naturalized, which means that you need to take a test and you need to speak the language and be part of the culture and the nation and all of that. So there's a standard to equality. The moment we introduce standard to equality, we have introduced inequality, right? So no standard. We are equal because we are different. Difference is our power. If we're in our gifts and we coordinate our gifts, we can do something huge. And I actually asked a Zapatista elder, Like, where is this wisdom coming from? It's in nature. Just look at nature. So here we have the milpa. What is the milpa? Better known in English as the Three Sisters Garden. And there's more sisters usually, but the main ones are the corn, the beans, and the squash all together, which is very, very different from the agriculture we see here in Fresno, that we see in Oxnard, where I'm from, that we see all over Cali and other places where everything is the same, right? And then everything that is different has to be killed off, pesticided off, right? Herbicided off, cited, genocided, right? Everything that is different has to be killed off. So then that's a logic of sameness, our dominant agriculture. Native agriculture in these lands has been the milpa, the three sisters, which is you have the corn, and the corn is known as the leader. It's this tall, tall stalk, and it's actually a very heavy feeder on the soil. At the same time, you plant beans, and the beans use the tall corn stalk as a trellis. And what the beans do very magically, because it really is all magic, is that beans fix nitrogen from the air into the soil, right? That the corn is taking. And then the squash, which is like the pumpkins or just any squash, they have these really big leaves and they crawl. And so what those leaves do is that they protect the soil from drying out, also preventing weeds. And so three extremely different plants who in their power coordinate to create this beautiful food garden that has been around for thousands of years. And so this is how I think that we can learn in terms of like, how do we do horizontality? And the way that we have heard and practiced even horizontality is that, well, it has to be a horizontal staff, no executive director, right? But then that could work. There needs to be some things in place for that. And one is that the board now has to be heavily involved in personnel questions, right? That's usually the ED part. Uh, and also there has to be very clear job descriptions that, people follow. And if there's any informal power, and there's a lot of informal power, right? Like someone has more trust from the community because they've been there longer or because their father is powerful or something like that, right? Informal power has to be talked about. And so all of these things are, it can happen, but certain things have to be in place. Could it be horizontal with an ED? We think yes. How do we think yes? Well, if we understand clearly the difference between strategy and tactics. So what I have seen in Native communities is assemblies that strategize, and the leadership does the tactics. So what's strategy and what's tactics? Strategy is like, we've done strategic planning. We know like strategy is like our bigger plan for to meet our vision and our mission. Tactics are just those tools and those methods that you use in order to advance strategy. And they should be discarded immediately if they are hindering strategy. One very specific example of what was supposed to be a tactic and has now become a strategy because there was no strategy outside is voting. And this is something in Black communities, and I want to cite specifically George Jackson, who was a Black Panther intellectual in prison, who was assassinated in San Quentin in 1971. He wrote two books, and in one of his books, Soledad Brother and Blood in My Eye, one of his books, he talked about how voting was just supposed to be a tactic to be able to expose the contradictions of this country, but it ends up becoming a strategy that we can't get rid of. Why? Because there's no strategy outside of how we use voting, right? So a tactic is a tool. It's supposed to be just a tool that the leadership can use as long as it's advancing the strategy that the assembly has decided on. And in our context, an assembly, and we're very, very small CLT, so it's probably easier as a small CLT to start something like this is the tenants and the membership, right? And the community, the actual people who are impacted decide the strategy, and the staff go in like trained soldiers doing tactics. But it means we have to be trained in that world of the above and the below, in that very bourgeois world that Brenda was talking about, right? That knows how to talk to developers and the IRS and the accountants and all of that on behalf of a bigger thing that is the strategy, right? And if a certain tactic is hindering a strategy, then it's time to shake that tactic off and figure out another one, right? And so this is about power flow more than it is about the specific form. So horizontality, not necessarily about the form of horizontality, like staff or horizontal, but how power is flowing in a way where it's still structured, where it's still organized, because there is something called the tyranny of structurelessness, which is something that came out of the movements from the 60s and 70s, right? Where everyone, you don't want the boss, you don't want the politicians, get rid of all of them. Let's just not have a structure, except that if we don't have a structure, there's going to be an informal structure that gets created, right? And so then there's still power flowing. So we need to be intentional about how power is going to flow. And I just want to wrap up by showing something that I don't know if well, here's a photo of the rows, right, of the very of industrial agriculture where things the same, same, same. This is in Ventura. I don't know who here plays chess or knows how to play chess. Like I know how to play chess. I don't like playing chess. I don't like how it makes me feel like I'm in war. Oh, I know you play chess, Rita. I know you do. Um, so chess is very famously a strategy, a tactics game actually, but the whole thing is about it's a zero sum game. So you're either above or you're below, right? You got to take the king. That's it. It's war. It's a strategy, a military strategy game. Not all strategy is military, but The Art of War by Sun Tzu, that is a book of military strategy of how to win a war, very much chess like, right? And so what I like to show, because I saw an artist do this, change up the chessboards where he like put two rooks together, two knights together and called it like, like the queer or like the homosexual chessboard, like, like as an art piece, and then put four rows of pawns against the royalty and called it revolution. And I actually played this. And if you set up the chessboard like this, where the pawns are the weakest pieces, right? And a lot of us don't have a lot of resources and we don't feel like we have a lot of power. But if we look at the chessboard and if we get the weakest pieces together, and something about chess is that like the pawns have 1 point, and like the queen I think has like 7 or 9 points, and like a rook has 6 points. Like they have different points. And so the nobility, they all have their 32 points. 31 because the king doesn't have a point, but we can give the king a point. 32. So if we equalize the power where we have 32 points versus 32 points, 32 pawns versus the 32 points of the monarchy, if you play this, you can win as long as you stay together with the pawns. If you play with the pawns, you stay together and you can win. And this is not something that we're taught, like, and then again, it's about looking at power and restructuring that power so that it flows in a strategic way in order to win. I'll pass it over to Brenda.
Thank you, Kiki. How does this translate in our work? Like we have to be intentional when we are about to do a land acquisition, especially if you're a CLT, you get your very first one. It changes the dynamics. There's responsibilities. And if you don't understand the historical context of, like, why are we in this chessboard of real estate, And if we don't understand how the conquer divide happens even within the affordable housing complex, then scale is going to happen and we're going to forget the whole purpose of why we are a CLT. And so we want to make sure that we understand that we still have to do our due diligence and being administratively good with our documentation because remember we're trying to keep stuff in perpetuity and but the information documentation to our communities is so vital. Can you go back to the above and below? I just want to say that we are soldiers that, and I learned this from Kiki because she sometimes I would tell her, I feel so overwhelmed because sometimes I have to be the bad guy to the community, or I have to give bad news, or sometimes I'm hearing what the above is discussing in these like closed doors. And and then she said, no, you have to be armored. You are a soldier going to the above to be able to report back to the below. And so sometimes when it gets really, really difficult, and is when, we pass a measure and they try to take it away, or you don't get that win, or community themselves are pitting against each other, and it gets so tough in the work and it just feels so overwhelming. I'm reminded that we're soldiers, that we have an assembly, and that we're going to get guided, and that we take it back to Mother Nature because it shows our answers. She's giving us the way that we should be working with in this world of capitalism, of what does it mean to be horizontal. Man, plantitas get it. We should get it too. And I want to have some time for discussions of big walk feeling, anything you feel that you can resonate to what we've mentioned, or and we're happy to answer any questions. So thank you. No one? Oh, oh, go first and then you three.
Um, so we were really blessed to be able to launch our land trust with funding that allowed us to stipend community members to come together and and build the land trust. And we had a group of like 10 folks that met together weekly for a year and read every single line of the bylaws and created our tripartite board, membership board, and the criteria for being a member and all this stuff, right? That's really thoughtful and really beautiful. But now that we have an acquisition and we're starting to staff up, um, I'm trying to implement from the gate like a non-hierarchical leadership situation, but I'm also trying to hire community. And because I've been the person who's been really blessed to also be able to go, behind enemy lines and learn all this esoteric, I call it bro knowledge, right? Like all the development bros, like, right? And I've been able to gather some of that and bring it back. I'm in this position where, um, I want to hire community. I want to hire, and there's people that are so talented and so amazing, but bridging that gap is hard. So my original, so that's a two question. One, we have right now our org chart is a Venn diagram, but the idea is that there'll be like the executive director, the organizing director, and the operations director, but they're not ready to do that yet. Like there's like this training gap. So I can either go hire folks that know how to do this, or hire for community and train, which is like a harder for me. So I don't know if you guys come across something like that. How do you bridge that gap between like getting the community into this work that, being para la par con ellos to go do the work when we confront los de arriba. Um, because the values is what matters most to me. But how do you fill that gap? And then the second part of that is when you grow, I keep thinking like when we have seven people, Venn diagrams don't work anymore. Like what does that look like when, I don't know.
Mhm. Oh, I don't know if you.
I was I don't know if Josie Aguilar is in this room, but she has just she had to go. Yeah, she had to leave, but she has something really Brilliant to say, because I had this question to her yesterday, last night, because they tried a horizontal structure and everything. Um, and I was telling her, assembly strategizes, and then like the trained people go in and do tactics. And she said, what's so important is curriculum, is to always teach, especially because this is intergenerational, right? Like, not because a lot of the time what happens with organizations, just the nature of work in the society, is that a lot of us leave with the knowledge, right? And it's in our head and it's not documented somewhere. It wasn't really passed down. So the importance of passing down the knowledge. So that's like the importance of reporting back in like the way that like Brenda was saying, in a way that is understood, because there's a big difference between data and information, right? Like we can throw all of our documentation in a Google Drive, but if we can't communicate what it is, like how is the next generation going to even understand what we left behind? And so something really key that we talk about is, everything that we write down, every email. I don't want to stress y'all out, but this is the truth as a CLT. Every email we write, every document we write, this is going to be read 120 years from now by those generations. And how do we want to show up for those youth who we're not going to get to meet in this life, right? So that I think about that a lot, and I thought that the curriculum piece was the way she even just used the word curriculum, like be intentional about teaching about the education part rather than just the documenting part.
I just want to add also, it's important to, uh, when you're training your soldiers, to then not, because people, I'm going to say this, sometimes there's fear. There's fear that comes within our communities because you're changing. I personally experienced this. Um, in understanding certain things that happens in these like back doors and these like affordable housing like transactions, and then you're trying to communicate with community, and then you're like, you're being top down, and I'm like, No, like don't kill the messenger. I'm just trying to let you understand like what is out of my control, and how, and I'm trying to we're trying to teach you what's happening. And so I think the curriculum is important, but for me, it's a constant reminder that I'm of service. I am no better. You know, it could be the beanstalk or the squat. No one's better. Just because the elote, the corn, is taller, doesn't make it better. And so that's, I think, important as we're developing those skills within our community to share. Thanks, Rita, and then
Thank you so much. I think you might have answered quite a bit of this, but I wrote my question down because it's getting late and I have senior moments. Um, it's describe the struggle when you're trying to implement the horizontal government structure and kind of define and describe some of the challenges. And can you put them into words? Because sometimes we're going through something, but we don't know how to put it exactly into words to describe what we're going through.
Putting into words, so being a little bit more specific about like as examples of these challenges of horizontality. Bullet points, yeah. Well, something that is very understandable to me, because I'm a grassroots organizer and I'm very suspicious of elite institutions. Incredibly, and I understand like there's a lot of triggers with that, right? There's a lot of um yeah, there's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of trauma when it comes to dealing with the bourgeois world. That starts, from when the time that we're really little, especially in the schooling system, which by the way is a huge place where we learn above and below because we're graded A, B, C, D, F student and all of that, and we're in constant competition. So then a lot of us who don't do well in school, for example, are just suspicious of people who have degrees, you know, and those of us who do have degrees and as an organizer who has a PhD, like it's something that I have to be careful, like, you know, how I show up because I already know what's already embedded in that title, right? Which I already know what it means. It means that I'm a specialist in a very, very tiny, tiny thing. But for the society, it means something that does not exist. That, you know, you're super intelligent about everything, right? So, so understanding like how like the values in a lot of those things that we're just taking for granted, the words that we're using have different meanings. So also being very very clear about how we're using, like how I use left, you know, I don't how I use that word and how I use right, you know, like just being very specific about how are we, you know, and not being afraid to ask, how are we using those words, right? Rather, how are you using the word capitalism, right? Like rather than assuming that we all know and then we end up disagreeing. And those are a couple of examples that I've experienced in. Also, the working in a farm. I worked in a farm for a couple years, and we created a co-op, and it came out of frustration that the office people, that is what happens with a lot of farms, the office people get paid more and the work is not so taxing on our bodies. And then like the field laborers get paid less, except that like so much of the farm is about them, right? So we tried to create this co-op, but we had to be really careful not to flip the positions of value where the field labor is more valuable than the admin, which is actually something that we experienced. That, you know, the admin people always think they're better, so we're going to make them think they're less, or we're going to devalue that work where it really needs to be horizontal in their difference. Not the same, but the admin people have to be great admin people and the field laborers have to be really great field laborers. The question is, of course, of compensation that ends up, I think, being that piece. But yeah, being able to like read when those things are traumas and when we're flipping the positions of value and non-value, which happens a lot because that's how we're taught.
Our board president had said one day, we're gonna CLTs have to do the boring work so the community to do the fun stuff. And sometimes when you're organizing, you're doing all the fun stuff, and all of a sudden now you're tasked with all the admin stuff. You're like, ah, like behind the computer all the time. The truth is, you gotta love what you do. So you gotta find people that they're gonna wanna be involved in all that computer stuff. You know, Kiki's an introvert. Like she can like do spreadsheets, oh whatever. And I tell her like my ADHD is kicking hard right now. But the truth is, understanding like those differences is was valuable. I know that you had a question. I don't know if you still want to ask it.
You kind of answered maybe, but I was going to ask, is it possible to have some cycling of roles? In other words, people will feel less like they're being talked down to if they're like, well, someday I'm going to be the messenger, or I'm going to be the one filling out the forms, and someday I'm going to be the one doing the organizing. If you move these cycle roles, is that possible, or is everything so specialized you can't even do that? Yeah, that's it.
That's a really good question. Like if you know you're going to be in rotation, you're probably going to appreciate somebody's work that you probably didn't consider. I just think that you're gonna have to document everything because if you plug in somebody who's out there community like doing community organizing and their expertise is not accounting and budgeting, and then all of a sudden you're asking them to sit behind a desk and do spreadsheets all day, might not necessarily work. Personally, for me, I always try to find what people enjoy the most because the worst feeling is being trapped in a job that you don't like and then you feel like it's sucking like the life out of you. And personally, I just think that if everybody has a special talent and if you're able to give it the right conditions, the right watering, the right water, the right soil, it's gonna, flourish.
Yeah, I have seen that done. I mean, I've experienced I have experienced it as we're actually trying it. Where we tried it at the farm, where the office people would go to the field, not necessarily to cycle roles, but to respect the work in the field. To not look down on it. And then when we did try to get the field folks to come and do the office, they didn't want anything to do with spreadsheets or anything like that. But it is something that I have seen in Native communities with their own governments is that they do capacitation and rotate out. So it does go slower a lot of the time, but the point isn't that kind of efficiency. The point is democracy to be able to spread out the tasks, especially because one person holding on to something can be very, very dangerous if no one else knows how to do it. So at least being able to do it, even if it's not going to be a permanent role or something like that is a really, really brilliant way, I think, to disperse power.
Thank you so much. It was so funny. I know about the three sisters and I didn't realize that the word in Spanish was Milpa. So so I was like, "Oh, what is that?" And I was like, "Oh, three sisters." Um, so yeah, I think I was just thinking about your question because we're trying to do the same thing. I'm currently the only staff person, but as soon as we bring on someone else, we want a collective model. And so I'm modeling it after Movement Generation. I don't know if you know them. Yeah, they I think the most important thing for me is that we all have the same job title. We're all like the same level. So we're all directors and we're all paid the same and we all have the same benefits from the first day. So, I'm still trying to figure out, you know, who to hire and like, we're obviously going to hire people of color who live in Oakland, preferably have lived experience of the people we serve. Um, but yeah, it is, I'm still trying to figure that out as well. But I know for us, at least the starting point is everyone is going to be paid the same and everyone's going to have the same um, level in the organization in terms of decision making power. So, so if you're starting, sorry.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you so much. If you're starting everyone, I get the same title, same pay. Are you then bringing in folks who are ready to operate at the level that you operate? Because then, like, I want to think about fairness in that, right? So if I'm doing all the training, slowly handing things off over the course of 2 years, um, and this is like maybe this is a values question. I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on it. Is it then fair that they make the same that I do when the work that I'm holding is more? Versus, which is my original question. Like, do I do that? Do I bring in folks? Which I think is what we're going to do. But then, like, bring in folks from community and train that gap. But I'm holding more of the work. Is that fair? You know.
This is the last thing I'll say. But yeah, I personally do think it's fair because I think labor is labor. And I don't think that I think that the conditions in my life made it so that I could have the education that I have and start the organization that I started. And so I think, yeah, to me, it makes sense that, if someone's putting in work, regardless of what that work is, if they're learning is work, to me, that's like, okay, so you work an hour, I work an hour, we both get paid for that time. And just going to throw in one, I don't think anyone should be working 40-hour work weeks either. So, I think we should all be making thriving wages with thriving benefits at like, 20, 30 hours a week. So that's kind of the perspective I come from is like, I don't care what level of work is happening. If work is happening, people should be getting the same thriving wage. Yeah. But I think just because of how low capacity we are, we probably will hire people who are already up to the same level of like expertise. Yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe that's the issue. I'm working a lot more time than they are right now, and maybe that's where the balance needs to come from.
I just wanted to share two things I've learned.
I'm at Oak CLT, and we work with the Disability Justice Culture Club, and um, they talk a lot about doubling up. So, like in DJ culture, making sure that in order for everyone to be able to rest, take care of themselves, not be well enough to do their job, you have to have somebody else who knows what they're doing and knows how to do what they're doing so that they can take a rest. Because so often EDs and other people in positions they're the only one with that information or the only one with that login or what, and it's like they can't take a break. So I feel like that's something I'm learning a lot from. And then the other is the anti-oppression resource training Alliance Aorta. They have a really rad structure for pay, and they actually recently changed it. They're a co-op. They have trainings that they have like sharings that they do around their pay structures. It used to all be um based around people's needs. So people would self-report, like how many family members are you supporting? Um, just like what are all the conditions that you're living under in a certain circumstance? And then that was actually how pay was structured. So it was just based on like what do you need to cover your basic needs, not like a random number associated with your value. But more recently, they've changed that to also include like is this a job no one else wants to do because it's so hard and takes all of your life energy? Then maybe you should get paid a little bit more because you're doing something that literally everyone else is like, I don't really want to do that. I want to be able to take the weekend off and not think about this, and that there is something there to be said about that. So I don't know. I just appreciate the work that they've done around that. And they're really generous with what they've done so far. They've documented the crap out of it and they're nerds about co-ops and horizontal structure. So I really recommend Aorta. They're the Anti-Oppression Resource Training Alliance, aka Aorta, like your heart, Aorta.
Hi everyone, Chayo. I'm with El Sereno Community Land Trust, but I also work for I have two cooperatives I'm a part of, and one of them, a structure that got it put into place was there's the toast and then there's the avocado. And what that means is basically the pairing up. And every person has a backup so that you don't have to be the only one. And we do that very purposefully and it has worked out really well. Also because I'm here and I'm not online with them, but and the way you structure in things are really simplistic ideas like having an away plan. What does that mean? Who's going to handle what tasks? You have an online password manager, share the vault with that other person. If it's things that are admin that other people can easily step in, maybe and if you're an organization of 4 or 5, then everyone can possibly have that login. So that at no point is there things stuck in the pipeline that needs to get done. Two, also uh, benefits are like equal, but implementing the 4-day work week, implementing unlimited PTO when it comes to health related issues, implementing, we even have this thing called adulting time off. So like things that really push the wellness because the burnout is so real that like if you're not taking care of yourself and your well-being, then you cannot be there. The last thing you need is you crash out and then you have to be like out for like a whole month and now you're back to the same cycle, right? So those are really two things that have been implemented. And in the other cooperative that I'm a part of, we actually have what we call and rest time. Everyone should definitively incorporate collective time off. I think it's a great idea where you're just shut down for like a week every quarterly or 3 times a year because it really allows to value the rest component that does not tap into your PTO. See. And then the other part was we have for the other cooperative, which is EcoSeam based, School for the EcoSeam, we do where you can choose to be off for like a month or 2 months. And then we implement the same thing where we're cross training so that you can take off or if life happens or if there's an emergency. And I think all these added to a council structure has really helped because it's very much horizontality in all of them. And then to address like really pressing things where you feel like, oh, I need to take that executive decision, is that it's also written in to where like I have to make a decision, tap into somebody else, and then the decision is made. Because some things you just have a deadline on and need to get done and set. But when you already have the guidance from your assembly and you already have the information from your coworkers, then you're already making this decision based off the collective. So, I don't know. Oh, that was it. Thank you.
Thank you for this talk. Really appreciate all the presentation stuff. Um, the organization that I'm with, the Bay Area Community Land Trust, um, we're in a really interesting transition moment where we have an opportunity to kind of reimagine some of our structures within the staffing team, how we engage with residents. Um, we have a lot of that history of horizontal or the hierarchy, a lot of bottlenecking at the top, a lot of founder syndrome stuff. We are inheriting all of this. We are also inheriting a lot of um, divided community. We're way past our first acquisition. We're in the, let's get our 11th building next year, that kind of thing. We're trying to figure out how can we reimagine these structures to bring these values into place, knowing that the plane is still flying. We have to rebuild the whole thing in real time. How do you build trust? How do you heal wounds? How do you restructure things? So I'm curious if you can speak at all to how to approach it feels like detoxifying the land. How do you heal from this, but also keep all of these administrative responsibilities going to build something, healthier 5 years from now?
I think we only have like 2 minutes, but I would love to answer that. Reach out to us because especially with founder syndrome and a lot of those topics, like Kiki, that I can like share. But I just want to say the important, the important thing is to remember that not all community land trusts are the same. And we found that you have to be able to collectively define what does community, what does land, and what does trust mean to you. And if you really start with that conversation, you're going to find that you all thought you're on the same page and you really weren't. We also went through, staff changes ourselves, and this is why we coming back with this report back. But we found that that's really like a starting point, I think. Um, I wish I could take more questions. I just want to say thank you so much. We'll stay behind to chat because we ran out of time. It's an amazing experience to be with you all, and I'm going to pass it to Kiki so she could also say something.
15 seconds. It just no, just what I think that what I would like to leave us all with in this room, and also to myself, just remembering. I think that in terms of healing, realizing that we're all different, and that is great. That's actually our power, and being able to find what our gifts are if we don't know them, or maybe like those that like our friends usually can tell us what our gifts are before we admit what our gifts are. That could be a way to do horizontality, because the above below, it's the horizon is towards sameness, and then that's like really low self-esteem, that's self-hatred, that's like envy, like all of these things, right? But finding each other, finding our own gifts and recognizing them and saying them out loud, saying them out loud and not being shy. Like, this is my gift. This is your gift. I think that's what I've noticed and have experienced leads to healing. So thank you all for being here and all of your gifts.